Perfect. So we're here for part 9 of Rise of the
Cool.
Expert.
Awesome.
And
Glad to
we're
be
here,
here.
of course, with Duane Hayes from Bulletproof Publishers. This is part 9, man. I can't believe we did so many of them so far. It's just awesome.
It's been great because it's given me a deadline to stick to, and we've been as productive as we've ever been. And
Oh, and
it
I
was an important
likewise,
time.
likewise, man. I usually don't put out this many consistent episodes. Sometimes
Right.
I end up, I end up, just slacking and taking
Right.
breaks and stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Right.
But
Yep.
anyway, we're here. So let's get into it, man. Part 9,
Sure.
Rise of the Internationalism aspect of
Yeah.
this. This is huge.
Yep. So this is all the rise of the expert, but we're breaking it down into different areas. And so part 9 tonight is about rise of internationalism. And not surprisingly, it really comes out of the university system. And so this is like the conclusion to their ultimate plan, right? The scientific expert on an international level to be able to govern, uh, nations. And so you're going to see a pattern here. It's the same as they use domestically. Okay, so you can see the cover, part 9, Rise of Internationalism. Can you see that, Andy?
Sorry about that. I was muted.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
it looks great too. I
Okay.
like this cover a lot. It
Yeah, so
says
that's
so much.
right. And I just kept it simple. But, when we are looking for experts and we talk about experts, and we've been talking now for going on 9 episodes about the rise of the expert, we've shown how it's infiltrated, all 3 branches of the American government, but also domestically into labor unions and the scientific management of people. And even in the Bible, bringing in the Schofield Bible as a reference Bible, a scientific sort of historical reference Bible. It's all of the same thing. And it's all built, a lot of the legislation that we saw and we've talked about through the National Consumers League, it was, through legislation that they'd done this. And so social reform is done through legislation, most effectively. And Brandeis learned this. And through his Brandeis brief, we see that these gentlemen on the screen here incorporate the exact same method when approaching the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And now this Paris Peace Conference, I knew vaguely, and the only things I could probably tell you about it prior to our research was that wasn't that, where they were supposed to make the world safe for democracy?
Right.
Or wasn't the Great War supposed to be there's a war to end all wars?
Oh, yeah.
So that's about all I knew. And that's probably about all anybody knows about the Paris Peace Conference. But this is the ultimate scene. I call it a crime scene. So we're forensic historians. And so Paris Peace Conference is really one of the places that the individual and our sovereignty was ripped away. And these gentlemen here, you're going to see they're all MAs, BAs, so the Master of Liberal Arts. And we have London School of Economics involved in here. We have connections to the Anglo-American establishment. So Cecil Rhodes, there's 3 factions here, the American Progressives, the Fabians, and the Anglo-Americans. So this British-American relationship, the reunion. So it's been, at this time, 1919, it's been just over 100 years since they fought each other. So it's been over that century, they went from mortal enemies, bitter enemies, to great allies and friends. And that relationship has stayed intact for now 100 years, where, American and British relations are self-evidently positive. There's no issues in between, American and British governments. And that is
Right.
actually shown by the desk. And I don't know if we covered this before, but the Resolute desk. Usually
I
when a
think you
president gets elected, he has a choice of there's like 6 or 7 desks that he gets to choose. And it's been the Resolute desk chosen for a string of presidents going back to Kennedy. And what that Resolute
Interesting.
desk, yeah. And what that Resolute desk was it was built out of the SS Resolute. That's the ship that they went on the Franklin expedition to see if they could find a Northwest Passage, and they got frozen in the ice and they all died.
Wow.
Well, when the ice thawed, that boat went out into the Atlantic Ocean and it was found, and they brought it to America, and America decided at that point, even though they weren't totally friends with Britain yet, they decided the right thing to do was to return the ship to Britain. So in honor of that, and as thanks, when they tore that ship apart to recommission all the boards and wood to build something else, they built a desk, and that was the Resolute desk, and they sent it to America as a thank you. And so ever since Kennedy, and Kennedy was the guy that brought it in. The president prior to him was using a different desk, and Kennedy brought in the Resolute desk. You can see, there's a famous picture of JFK Jr. under the president's desk, if you remember. That is the Resolute desk, and they put a panel on it to hide FDR's crippled legs. But this story of the Resolute desk just shows a connection between the Anglo, the Americans and the British. So we call that the Anglo-American establishment, and these guys are major involved in that. So that's the inquiry, and that's, the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations are in that. Founding lifetime member Isaiah Bowman, he's the leader of the inquiry. And here's Skull and Bones. This is his last name is Day. There's been a day at Yale every year since its inception. So his family goes way back to the beginnings of Yale. Here's a Skull and Bones. He's president. That's Charles Seymour. He ends up being president of Yale. And London School of Economics. This guy's he learns under Richard T. Ely and the Fabians, an economic model. And George Louis Beer is a key figure in bringing the British and Americans together to create the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs in Paris. So this is the origins of the think tank as well. So that's why I've got some logos there. This is really where it comes out of, Harvard and Columbia. And I got the Council on Foreign Relations logo there with Skull and Bones and Carnegie, because Carnegie's another hugely important corporation organization to know when it comes down to the, implementing international law in the world. So we start with this quote, Louis Brandeis.
Our old buddy, he's back.
Yeah. It doesn't take long before we're back into Brandeis. And, even the last couple episodes, we could have really centered him on it as well. But here is something quite fascinating to me. And this is why I was hoping to have as many people as we could on this podcast tonight, in that he's created Israel. We've already gone through that and shown the provenance and receipts, but he's also creating American foreign policy. Now, is there a more destructive pair on the planet right now than those two things?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so. So here's a quote from Louis Brandeis, a biographical sketch. And this is a book written about him by Jacob de Haas. And de Haas was his secretary, when Brandeis was the leader of International Zionism. Jacob de Haas was also the secretary of Theodore Herzl before that. So de Haas is important. We've talked about him moving to Boston and not too far away from Brandeis at critical key points in history. So it says a larger opportunity to exercise his influence came in October of 1917 when President Wilson publicly appointed Brandeis to collate the material on which the eventual peace should be established. Now they're talking about the upcoming Paris Peace Conference. And this is really why the inquiry was created. And it was created really the moment that they declared war. So it was April 1917, Woodrow Wilson finally joins the war. And it wasn't too long after that they were preparing for the peace settlements. And Brandeis is in Paris. He's not an official member of any delegation. And if you tried to look it up in history, it'd be hard to find him in Paris, but he was there. So the inquiry officially began with an August 1917 memorandum from Felix Frankfurter. Now he's in Paris and he's working with the French and the English, and they are already preparing for a peace conference that hasn't been, officially set. But, British and the French are old school colonialists, right? They've been around a long time. They got all kinds of colonial possessions around the world. secret treaties. These guys are the big brothers to America, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so Frankfurter's over there in preparation. You can see 1917, and he memos back, and he's stimulated by knowledge acquired in Paris of French efforts in the field of diplomatic planning. And so we cover this in some of our videos on the history of propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
But he sends this memo saying we better get our shit together. We better get these scientific, technical experts gathering stats and facts so that we can answer all the questions that are going to come up in Paris. And America's really behind. They don't have, at this point, they have no foreign policy. I mean, there's the Spanish-American War, and Theodore Roosevelt's involved in that. But never before here has an American president stepped on foreign soil as part of a diplomatic, meeting. And this is the first time ever they get Woodrow Wilson over into Paris. So the group of experts, as we know from previous research, was headed by Walter Litman, the inquiry's first secretary, beginning out of a small back room at the New York Public Library. Now, this, for those paying attention, it's 4 months after Trotsky leaves the New York Public Library and heads to Russia. He's in New York for about 4 or 5 months, and in earlier 1917, it really just coincides with American declaration of war, and then he fucks off. He gets the hell out of there. But there's something there. I think we should probably, if somebody could, research a little bit more there. I'd sure like to make a connection between, the American progressives and the creation of American foreign policy with Trotsky.
Yeah, that would be pretty juicy.
Well, there is major connections here to all of these guys. Normal, like we've already shown the principles of scientific management being shared with all of these guys, and this book being translated into every language. Mao is using it to control his people. And so that's what another thing that we're trying to get across here is that these guys are just working together. China, Soviet Union, United States.
Yeah, and this is what we saw. Like we saw that same thing with Norbert Wiener. Like his work was translated all over, widely popular, and passed around to all the different important people in this movement.
Yeah, I would say that the Russians and the Chinese are working on ways to perfect, social control, just the same as the Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see from the above quote from Jacob de Haas that Brandeis was given the initial responsibility by President Wilson of creating this group of experts. So that's what they are. They're international scholarly experts. It's really the first all-American experts is what I call them. The inquiry very much looking like the predecessor to the Council on Foreign Relations, boasting within its early ranks an eclectic mix of Ivy League academic scholars, professors, professional diplomats, politicians, advisors, and members of military intelligence. Now, that's really the member list of the CFR today. You can throw in, mainstream media personalities as well.
Oh, and I'd also like to throw in the king of alternative media as well. I would love if someone out there could make a montage of all the times on Joe Rogan Experience that he has talked about how cool it would be if we were just guided worldwide by a group of elders, man, like a group of elders that were experts in multiple fields. Half the people he has on his show, he fits the bill. He would mention people probably not anymore, but I think he mentioned Sam Harris during one of those little rants.
Sure.
But he probably doesn't agree with Joe anymore. But regardless, he's been talking about that kind of crap for a long time. And then just last year, you had Jordan Peterson start some coalition or something like that to fight the WEF.
Right.
And it's very interesting how, once again, we see this mechanism of controlled opposition filtering through alternative media as well as the mainstream, just on different levels for different purposes.
Yep, for sure. This would be more intellectual. This is going to sort of corral the intellects and the pseudo intellects that, approach the world differently, right? You're going to have aspects of propaganda that cover the lowest common denominator, but it's going to be important also to persuade those that are more intelligent.
Bingo.
And I would say that Rogan, and we've been saying this a while, is really the modern day Walter Lippmann.
Yeah, yeah, in a way, definitely.
He's
I
just
also say he's the modern day. Well, sometimes I would say he's the modern day Terrence McKenna, but at the same time,
right.
he's not.
Yeah.
That's just one finger that he wields. You know,
Yep.
he is Litman because he wears many different hats that
Yep.
appeal to a wide variety. You know.
Yep. And he persuades and, shapes public opinion in much the same way that Walter did, when he was around, just like Walter Cronkite, people would say, "What did Walter say today?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Lisa says Joe's an ass kisser. I agree.
yeah, all for sure. So here we show Brandeis, Litman, and Frankfurter are all essential in the founding of the inquiry. This is the precursor to the CFR. In fact,
There
the
it
main
is.
founders of the inquiry look a lot like the founders of the New Republic. Crowley, Walter Weil, and Alvin Saunders Johnson also considered founders of both. Crowley and Weil also House of Truth residents. Now, this is where it's going to get a little crazy because we have major international policy being created, and it's all House of Truth members. These guys all live together at this political salon 1 mile from the White House. So there's their logo too. So if you know anything about the Pilgrim Society, their logo looks a lot like this.
Mm.
Okay. And there's a reason it's a boat. I mean, we talk about it being about, cybernetics and government. The etymological origins of that word mean, to steer like a helmsman of
There.
a ship.
Yeah, it always goes
So,
back to nautical language.
right. So two connections there I draw people's attention to. And then we've just taken a clip out of one of their um, articles from back in the day, copyright 1914. This would be 1914, 1915, 1916, but it shows the editors there, Herbert Crowley, Walter Well, Walter Litman, and in behind the scenes there, Brandeis, Frankfurter, Alvin Saunders Johnson. These are really the guys steering the whole movement. You have Litman and Crowley and Weil filling their roles as editors, but there is a larger idea going on, and that's really what Brandeis and Alvin Saunders Johnson and Frankfurter are pushing. And now, if we remember who Alvin Saunders Johnson is, he's the guy that was working with the executive committee. Trying to remember the exact name. To do with foreign scholars in need of aid during the Second World War, and they brought over the New School for Social Science Research, and they, made their home in Columbia, and it's become a major American institution ever since. So Alvin Saunders Johnson, deeply influential too. Just one of these guys that we don't hear a lot about, but yeah. So interesting to note the timeline here, and that Brandeis was also in deep negotiations with the U.S. and British governments regarding the drafting of the Balfour Declaration, dated November 2nd, 1917. So he's creating American foreign policy and Israel at the same time. Both the inquiry and Israel, created during the fall of 1917, and Brandeis can very easily be considered the directing influence in both. As discovered previously, the many drafts of the declaration passed through the hands of Brandeis literally for final approval. His involvement with the founding of the inquiry now means Brandeis is central to the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the very first ever 501c not-for-profit think tanks. We all know the issues there. That's one of the major contributing factors to the present situation in America. Is lobbying, deals being made by money behind closed doors, and these guys really started it. There's philanthropy prior to this, and there's think tanks. They weren't called think tanks, but I would say for all intents and purposes, the modern beginning starts here. So Brandeis counseling and directing the first foreign policy experts, the first political philosophers, the founding path setters for Henry Kissinger, Brzezinski, and the coming American century. Now, that is something I've taken from some more historians, that, they look at Walter Litman because of, his foreign policy philosophy, and that he was a political philosopher, sort of trained out of Harvard under George Santayana and William James, that he's really a pioneer to men like Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. So, that puts him in rarefied air there too, and that he's a foreign policy expert. And Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski really have been a big problem, for
Mhm.
America. Just they've really perpetuated American foreign policy in this, killing from good, safe distances and, you know, PNAC and just where we're going and what
Right.
we see today in Israel and in this same area that we're going to get into, Central Europe. There's a war going on in the exact same place 100 years later. This is 100 years after the war to end all wars. So we have to start wondering why it is that they're there if it isn't for peace.
Right.
So, in fact, Litman trained by George Santayana and William James Well at Harvard to be the political philosopher. This was the thing that George Santayana is famous for, other than his quote about not knowing our history and condemning ourselves to repeating it. He was, famous for trying to push this political philosopher. And you can go back to Plato's Republic and sort of that perspective that they had, that society won't be proper until philosophers are kings,
Right.
kind of invokes that same
Dude,
philosophy.
this is not to go back to him and not to give him any attention, but yeah, Rogan literally talks about the philosopher king idea
There you
and
go.
how that's what we need in society.
And
So let it be known, Joe Rogan is ushering in the great society just as all these others have before him.
yep, and that's why I would say that he is the new Litman, the modern day Litman, because he is a political philosopher, Rogan. That's
Yeah,
the role he
absolutely.
fills. And if he's pushing that, then he's pushing this, you know, scientifically governed society.
Right.
So, they're talking about Lippmann as forefather to both Kissinger and Brzezinski, setting the tone in the promotion of strong nationalist foreign policy through preparedness and efficiency. This is the progressive message. The correcting of backwards races from a good safe distance. This is one of the phrases that they always use. This is one of the continuities of language that we see over the entire 20th century, is that they're all calling these other countries backwards. And so then they have to go liberate them. And then that creates the synthesis, right? There's a problem, reaction,
Mm,
solution.
always.
And so this is how they start wars, and really probably most based on economic issues rather than liberating populations. So the inquiry of the first modern technical advisors made independent of the government. So that's a camera, if you will. From our last episode, we talked about what a camera is, the cameralists, how they're really
Mm,
founding a lot of this scientific expert.
yep.
So this also making Brandeis a pioneer in the shaping of American foreign policy for the next 100 years, establishing the expert inside the administration of a sitting U.S. president with the help of Litman and Frankfurter. One cannot deny America goes from non-interventionalist to warmonger under Brandeis's sage guidance. So it's 4 months from being elected on his second term, because he kept everybody out of the war, kept America out of the war. This was really how he was elected to the second term. And then in 4 months, they were declaring war and
Right.
their own participation in the First World War. So that's a famous volte-face sort of turnaround that Wilson historians always question, and there's much debate as to why he did that. And the mainstream historians acting as gatekeepers sort of shrug their shoulders and don't really come up with an answer why. Well, we figured it out. He's being persuaded by these advisors, and there's obviously a larger agenda going on. And we say that American involvement in really the First World War was all orchestrated to create these circumstances in which they could then manipulate the American government and the Brits to creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. I think is a major motivating factor. Plus, this move to internationalism, right? This is the war inspires all of this.
Hmm.
So, Inquiry founder James T. Shotwell, he's one of the gentlemen in that picture that I showed at the beginning on the thumbnail. He's Columbia history professor and Carnegie Endowment historian. So he's working with Carnegie underneath Elihu Root, who was the Secretary of War under both Taft and Roosevelt. So there's a movement here that sort of the torch gets passed from Roosevelt to Taft to Wilson. And it's the same foreign policy, the same movement to international law over material force of arms. So Shotwell was assigned with the task of recruiting professors and scholars specifically from the political and social sciences. Okay, so here we are with these guys studying society, social engineers,
Right.
and they were specifically targeted. They wanted,
these are their golden boys.
Yep, and so Master of Arts,
liberal arts.
Yep, and all professors at Ivy Leagues, basically. So Shotwell, one of the very first members of the inquiry, along with Colonel House, Walter Litman, and Archibald Carey Coolidge. Now, those are like 4 of the first 5. And 3 of those are lifetime founding members of the Council on Foreign Relations, House, Litman, Coolidge. So Shotwell himself recruited by none other than Herbert Croly. He's a House of Truth resident, but founder of the New Republic. Croly important for 3 reasons. There's a picture of him there. His 1909 publication, as we've covered ad nauseum here, The Promise of American Life, served as the inspiration for Roosevelt's 1912 Bull Moose Party campaign and was the very manifesto to the progressive movement. He was a resident at the House of Truth and co-founder of the New Republic. Croly, a close intimate of Brandeis, Frankfurter, Litman. And I left myself a little message here. And there it is. So this is how they cross promote each other. Because I'm going through all of these progressive magazines like The Outlook, like Harper's Weekly, Harper's Monthly, American Magazine, McClure's. Okay, these are all sort of, I'm sure that most people would be familiar with those names, but they're all progressives. They're all progressive rags. So they're all promoting Roosevelt and this whole movement. So you can see there that Roosevelt's promoting both books. In the Outlook magazine, he's talking about progressive democracy, the follow-up to The Promise of American Life in 1916, I believe, and then Drift and Mastery, and they're coming out at the same time, Litman and Croly. And so he's pointing everybody to be reading these books. And what do they call for but a scientifically governed society and a giant monolithic federal government.
Right.
So, they're really pushing like federalist ideas, federalism.
And it's always the revolving door between government and private, federal and not federal. Like these experts are all on the sides. There's no, the government can wipe its hands clean so easily. Like there's no one. This is where the octopus idea comes from, or the Hydra, where you cut one head off and 3 grow back.
Yeah. And this was a major problem too. And we'll get to that with the State Department. They were upset because all of these private citizens that were making major decisions were able to just go back into their private lives after this with no consequence, which would be not the case for an elected official.
Right.
Even though we see today that even if you are an elected official and you screw up badly, you can still, maintain
pretty
your
much.
position.
Yeah, exactly.
So it states in this Outlook magazine, the 2 noteworthy books on democracy by Theodore Roosevelt, Progressive Democracy by Herbert Croly, and Drift and Mastery by Walter Litman. No man who wishes seriously to study our present social, industrial, and political life with the viewing of guiding his thought and action so as to work for national betterment in the future can afford not to read these books through and through and to ponder and digest them. They worthily carry forward the argument contained in the author's previous works, The Promise of American Life and A Preface to Politics. So here is James T. Shotwell, key guy in the inquiry, talking about how he was recruited in his book at the Paris Peace Conference. We're going to reference this a few times tonight. So one day in September 1917, there was a telephone message from Mr. Herbert Croly, editor of the New Republic, that Colonel House wanted to see me. I had spent the late spring and most of the summer in Washington from the first weeks of America's entry into the World War as chairman of the National Board for Historical Service, the wartime organization of the historians of the country. The colonel wanted to see me in connection with preparations for the peace conference, which would sooner or later have to be called at the end of the World War. Shotwell mentioning his work with the National Board for Historical Service, but failed to mention that it was a part of the Committee on Public Information. This is America's first ever propaganda division. And he, like we talked earlier about, having to propagandize against the intellectuals just the same as the lowest common denominator, we see the CPI doing the exact same thing. So anybody that was, going to inquire, into the history of things on a sophisticated or intellectual level by picking up real books and reading, well, Shotwell was kind of at the faucet there. Well, George Creel, the head of CPI, was, they were influencing more on a lowest common denominator level, like the 4-Minute Men. It was like 70,000 people that would do speeches in this lead up to getting American involvement in the war, because at this point, America was non-interventional. They didn't want anything to do with any foreign entanglements. They were pacifists. And so to move an entire country from pacifist to, warmonger or interventionalists, it took probably the largest propaganda scheme ever in those months leading up to the declaration of war. They were the 4-Minute Men. And so that they would do advertisements in the movie theaters and everywhere that they could, just to persuade Americans to want to go to war. And it was hugely successful. And this is really where they realized that out of, crisis government or wartime, they could carry that forward into peacetime too, after the war, and still continue to influence and persuade the American public in much the same way. This is really where they kind of learned the Hegelian ropes, and they started to put all this philosophy together in the persuasion of society. And so it shows here that it's Crowley that phones Shotwell to get him to start recruiting all of these guys. So it's a strange thing. Herbert Crowley is not associated necessarily with the inquiry, but he's definitely a resident at the House of Truth, and he's a founder of the New Republic, and he's in with these guys big time. So it shows, involvement by the New Republic.
Oh, yeah.
In, creating this peace conference group of scientific experts. And so he talks a little bit more about it on page 3 in how he's showing how the inquiry was created. So that book, I think, is easy to find. Just put at the Paris Peace Conference archives, and you should get the archive.org rendition, and you can go through all of that if you wish. And it may even be on our website. I'm not sure. I'd have to double check. So there's Shotwell. He's involved with the CPI. So he's in the same organization as Edward Bernays, spreading propaganda.
Yeah, literally the king of propaganda.
Yeah,
the father of propaganda.
Yeah, and Edward Bernays is in Paris working with all these guys too. They're rubbing shoulders. So there's a picture of James T. Shotwell at his desk at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 1960. So he's much older then, but you can see that it's, he's been involved with Carnegie now for over 40 years. And he's important because he's the founder of the International Labor Organization. Now, we talked about labor unions domestically and how they became the scientific expert between the entering wedge between, the worker and his own labor. Well, they just decided to do the same thing internationally. And James T. Shotwell here's the primary author of the first ever International Labor Organization. So if you think about Marxist theory, right?
Yep.
So we're setting up Marx's dream here at Paris 1919. He's a professor of history at Columbia and director, Division of Economics and History at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he is considered the main author of the International Labor Organization, established during the peace talks in Paris as a necessary attachment to the League of Nations. The League of Nations and the ILO, both aspects within the eventual Treaty of Versailles. And according to Shotwell, the major obstacle for the formation of both the ILO and the League of Nations was the U.S. Constitution. So there's the Treaty of Versailles. And then within that, we have the League of Nations. And then within that, we have the ILO. And they had to match their constitutions. And the major obstacle was, sovereignty, American sovereignty. Because when you think about what they're doing here is they're creating an international authority that's going to subvert the authority of the sovereignty of any country. It just so happened that America was the one that, was the difficult one. And this is why you see the League of Nations fail when it gets brought back to America and Congress votes it down twice.
What's crazy to me is that, as you're researching this old literature, it's stated so matter of factly. I've probably said this before, and it's in retrospect, hindsight, it's like, my God, these researchers had gold that they didn't know. They had no idea what to do with it.
Yeah. And we're going to get to everything you just said in the most fantastic way, man, in this right here tonight within the next hour. So the ILO logo, does that remind you of anything?
Oh, man. Yeah, I've seen it a few different places.
Well, it's the UN, right? It's so anybody that's out there that may have issues with me saying that the League of Nations grows into the UN, just go onto the UN's website and look at their history. They'll tell you that. And so I just threw in this logo from the ILO, and just to show they're using the same colors, same sort of wreath, same design.
And it has this gear or
Gears.
whatever. And it's funny. I mean, I'm not paranoid necessarily, but some people like to go a little further. And each of these 3 gears has 6 little gears on
Look
it.
at that.
Six,
I didn't even notice that. Good eye. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So anybody that doubts that the League of Nations eventually turns into the UN, I mean, just keep listening, because we're going to show you how these same people are involved in the creation of the League of Nations a generation later, James T. Shotwell included. So he states here regarding the U.S. Constitution on page 59 at the Paris Peace Conference, the problem here is the most delicate of all. Can international action go so far as to interfere in the internal affairs of a sovereign state? That would be the recognition of a world state in the most sensitive part of government machinery, the power to enforce law. Its purpose would be to bring up the backward states, so there he is saying backward states, to as near the standards of progressive countries as possible. Now, the entire American delegation is basically progressives in Paris. So it's obvious what's happening. There's no conservatives or Republicans there at all.
Right.
So in order that progressive states themselves should not be kept behind, because we are always moving forward, aren't we? So yet nothing can run more counter to the principles of national sovereignty as understood and applied throughout the world than this interference with the enforcement of law. So they're stating it. They know it. That makes them complicit, but they are being told a noble lie that, internationalism is going to be the answer over material force of arms. And who at this point can argue? It's still to this day a good idea. It's just how they went about it.
Right.
We would all rather not be fighting physically with our neighbor and find ways to be more diplomatic and have harmony, right?
Truth brings up an interesting point as well, that the Lucius Trust, which was formerly known as the Lucifer Trust, does all the publishing for the UN.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. The coincidences just keep piling on,
Yeah, and I would say if I was going to use the word evil, it would be this plan here, this international plan, this rise of the expert. It's really just usurping all of our authority, taking us away from ourselves too, all at the same time. So Shotwell's plan for an international labor organization called for the employment of men and women independent of governments, social science experts superseding all national authority. It is the first creation of an institution participated in by workers, capital, and governments to deal with the problems that are most real to most people the world over. Those that have to do with the day's work. Okay, so that's the most common thing throughout the world is our labor. So this is really primarily why they wanted to get everybody underneath, one umbrella. It
Yeah, it
gives them
makes
the
sense.
greatest chance to create a hive mind, right? It's like why they try to do these halftime Super Bowl satanic shows, because they know everybody's eyes are on it.
Right, and that's the superficial layer. This is more of the matrix underneath, you know.
Yeah. Yep. This is kind of the blueprint that everything else is built on,
Yeah, because
just
they
like we've
have to
shown.
attack, as I say over and over again on my show, they have to attack things that we naturally are drawn to or things that we absolutely agree with and need. That's
Yeah.
what they usually hijack and use.
Hmm.
This, of course, being the central thing in most of our lives, which is, financial need,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Right. And they've made this world the way it is
Mhm.
so that they can exploit us that way, right? So it might more accurately, he stated, have been termed the International Industrial Conference, or better still, the International Organization for Social Justice. According to Shotwell, the ILO could be established only if it is based upon social justice, which enabled them to tie the ILO into the structure of that new world order, which the League of Nations symbolized. Now, he says that on page 54. Somewhere
Wow,
here, I have it. I think it's right here. So you can see
that's
he's written New
unreal.
World Order right now. And that basically lays down exactly what happened. And, we see it today. There's so many parallels between then and today regarding how they're doing it, social reform through social justice. We all are
Right.
familiar with the social justice warrior, Karens, you know, uh, BLM was one giant social justice mission. And so they're still using social justice as a catalyst. And this is really, exploiting our liberal sentimentality, because no matter what side of the aisle you are on, you are still human and you still embrace the classical liberal aspects, right? You still, no matter what you believe and who you follow or who you voted for, your ability to speak is important to you.
Right, exactly.
And so they capitalize on that. Whether you're a conservative or a liberal, we have liberal sentimentalities. And so how does a vampire enter your house? Well, it has to be invited.
Hey, bingo.
And it's the same thing here. So I just circled that there so you can see where I got it from. And to me, that's a primary source. That's the creator of the ILO talking about why they did it.
That's unreal.
So the ILO meant, and here's an interesting thing. So I'm showing these maps in behind. These are official inquiry maps. These are the maps that they used to reorganize Central Europe. And you can see here, Isaiah Bowman has signed this one, February 21st, 1919. So the ILO meant to be the beginning of a continuous cooperation on the part of labor, society, and governments, not just a one-time charter, but a series of them, a living international law that changed with society. So how is that any different than the Brandeis Brief and sociological jurisprudence, creating the philosophy of American law that changes with society? So they were able to get everybody on this progressive hamster wheel, and then because everybody believed that society was that way, now they were able to change all the institutions to fit this pseudo reality that they've created. And so
This is
it,
such a long con and
yeah,
slow. They are so patient. It's terrifying. It does remind you of vampires.
totally. Yep. And wait till I don't have a picture of him, but we are releasing a video on this stuff, like a documentary video. It's maybe 20 minutes long. And at the
Excellent.
end, we've got a picture of Robert Cecil, and he looks like a vampire coming out of the uh, Palace of Versailles.
That's
It's like
hilarious.
incredible. So, living law, changing with society. So, on an international level now, usurping American sovereignty, the recognition of non official representation in an official international body was the expert entering wedge gaining a foothold on the international stage, and it was the first of its kind. Shotwell stating in the chapter entitled Social Justice in the Peace Treaties, it was clear that some device would have to be found for the limitation of the powers of these non-official representatives, and yet it was necessary that that limitation should not be carried out to the point of endangering in any way the reality of their work. So we got to be careful that these experts don't totally create a dystopian nightmare, but we can interfere with their work too. So there's a fine line that they're trying to find.
So this really tells you that like not everybody is complicit necessarily,
Yep.
like on the, not consciously.
Yep.
They're all being hijacked
Yep.
and used.
Yep.
It's usury, and it's
Totally.
every layer is compartmentalized. It's so nuts. It's like
Yep.
the typical spy movies where one spy kills the guy that they're sent to kill, and then the guy behind him kills him, and then the guy behind him kills him. It's so crazy. You're
on fire because you're bringing up points that we're going to cover, because this is really the origins of intelligence. This is, you know how they say the OSS is the precursor to the CIA? You hear that all the time.
Yeah.
Well, this is the precursor to OSS.
Yeah.
Now, these guys are the creators of American intelligence, because they're the founders of the OSS that turns in, and the Dulles brothers are here. So,
oh God, yeah. So,
and I'm going to show you them.
Who
here.
else would be, right? It comes to the intelligence community. Who else would be at the root of it other than psychologists and social scientists?
Right, exactly. If it's going to be a mind war and they're going to try to get us to believe different things, who else would it be?
Yeah, mind war. That's an interesting point. I mean, totally separate, but mind war brings to mind Aquino.
Yeah.
And that whole sector of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
But they're pushing Aquino in the same direction. This is all about societal control.
Right.
And that's why he was allowed to continue his work there. It's much the same as what they're saying here. And I would say that that's exactly what happened, and how he was still allowed to be a key member in the military.
Right.
It's because he is one of these guys that, I call them intelligent creatives, and they know that if they were just to let him take over and rule, things would not be good, because they probably don't trust him either, much like Kinsey. But they don't want to get in his way, because he's exploring things like trying to pass through buildings and all of this other stuff that they are entertaining. The mythical, the magical, they are still entertaining these things. The Men Who Stare at Goats, this is a legitimate program that they had. And so they are at this point entertaining all aspects of ways that they could control society. So they're Aquino is a great example. Imagine if they were just to leave him to his own devices, where we would end up. It would be scary.
Yeah,
so
just look at the Temple of Set.
Same with Kinsey. Rockefeller stepped away from funding them, at least publicly, because of all of the sexual stuff that was, all the stories of, and the perversion that was coming out of his investigations with children, and even kids younger than toddlers. We get into some deeply psychotic stuff when we talk about Kinsey, and he's a Phi Beta Kappa as well, by the way.
Oh, how about that? What a surprise.
Funded by Rockefeller. And not to go off on too much of a tangent here with Kinsey, but he's the guy that creates the sexual behavior of the female and the sexual behavior of the male. Two books that are today probably the most cited on and believed, much like Darwinism. We believe in Kinsey's interpretation of our behavior sexually, but he's only an accredited zoologist.
It's so dark. That's so fucked up. And it was like an award-winning movie in the 90s.
Yes. Yeah.
With Mr. Liam Neeson, who
can't get and you know old. What? I have it here, and I just have not been able to watch it, but I do have it here. I've put it in a couple times to try to watch it, and just I can't go there.
Yeah, there's a bunch of movies like that for me these days.
Yeah. So he's talking non-official representatives, and how do we keep these guys in control? A fine line was to be drawn between giving unelected officials omniscient powers over nations and still allowing these social scientists to apply their expertise unfettered, the consequence of which could be the creation of what Shotwell rightly called a superstate. Shotwell admitting the delicate nature of negotiations when attempting to jam a square peg into a round hole. The entire idea of an international authority is in direct contrast to that of a sovereign nation state. So the Western countries, each with their constitutions, and more importantly, each with a population that believed in those constitutions. Now that is the main hurdle. So they had to create text and a way to word all of this that offended the least. So eventually Shotwell, with the help of none other than Felix Frankfurter, created the necessary text to skirt around the constitutional issues involved with the drafting of the International Labor Organization. And I've included that page here where Shotwell talks about how Frankfurter comes over and actually they get it to a point where they like what they're talking about and the plan that they have, and then Frankfurter, writes it all in. And he goes all the way back. He's a counsel for the government, Frankfurter, at this point for 20 years. He was working under Elihu Root, Henry Stimson, and Taft, all three Skull and Bones, all Phi Beta Kappa. So he's been doing this a long time. So they just hand off this work to Frankfurter, and he efficiently goes about his business and gets her done. So he states here, after dinner, worked all evening in my room on the text of the labor agreement with Beer, Frankfurter, and Shepherdson. Now, Whitney Shepherdson, you can internet search him right now. He is a founder of the CIA.
Wow.
Yes. So a brilliant suggestion from Beer solved the first main difficulty, and we came to agreement on a second point, and Frankfurter did the drafting, so that I had little share in the actual manipulation of the text, but it would never have been done if I had not started the compromise. So here we see Frankfurter, a member not of the American delegation, but the Zionist delegation in Paris, penning the text for the first ever International Labor Organization, fulfilling Marx's dream. Frankfurter, famously having a toe in every delegation in Paris, was there in Brandeis's behalf. They called Frankfurter the Cockleffel. It's a German, I'm not sure if that's German or what's the other language? Yiddish. It may be Yiddish.
Sure.
But it's called Cockleffel means cooking spoon. So he's in there stirring everything up. And they stated about his activities there that he had his toe in nearly every delegation. So he's a great persuader. He had an incredible personality. This is the things that we hear about Frankfurter, and that's why he's here. And that's why he is the mentor to Brandeis. And that's why he's in Paris, because he's the eyes of Brandeis here. So Litman leading the inquiry, the first expert entering wedge driven into the executive branch of the U.S. government. Now, the State Department authority was commandeered openly while they were on the Atlantic coming over, but even in New York, we started to see that these scholarly experts were starting to steer foreign policy, or, the direction and attitude of the president. And then in Paris, their superiority overshadowed by a collection of amateurish social science professors. Now, it deeply upset the State Department in Paris because the whole hierarchical chart got overturned, and the State Department was no longer being used as a advisor to the president and what they were doing there. And he went directly to this, what the State Department called a bunch of amateurs. So we talk about how the interpretation of the liberal arts are, it was the same thing back then.
Interesting.
Even though they have all the power, they are considered amateurs. So this is really the first deep state takeover. This is really what I see here. So the State Department, especially Robert Lansing, were understandably concerned. While everyone speaks of modern day deep state takeovers, we see Brandeis, Litman, and Frankfurter coordinating a soft coup d'etat within the U.S. government under crisis government. This is a term that a Columbia professor writes a book right after this called Crisis Government. And this is how they realize that if they can get people to do all kinds of things under the threat of war.
Or any kind of crisis for that matter.
Yeah.
Like a pandemic.
Like COVID. It's the exact same. That's why they declared war on it. Because then they can use crisis government to establish all kinds of crazy stuff.
Or terrorism.
9/11. Yep. Same with the war on terrorism, war on drugs. These are all
of it.
catalysts. They're using Hegelian dialectics. Right?
Absolutely.
Problem, reaction, solution, and they're doing it over and over and over. And this is what Hegel said. This is how you can tell history. History is told through dialectics. So, crisis government. Yes. Under crisis government over 100 years ago, a progressive revolutionary takeover that made itself at home and has never left. This is really what we're struggling under today. So Mr. Litman's, we talk about what he brought, and all of these guys that are here for a reason, because they're smart. A lot of these guys are graduating Harvard at 16 because they're just like polymaths, child proteges. And so they've commandeered these intelligent creatives and put them to work for the state against its own people. So I think we talked about that last week, a brain drain. So Mr. Litman's unique gift for clarifying the issues of politics, so widely known in the post-war period. So that's referencing his syndicated column, plus how he was a political philosopher after the war, explains the importance of the role he played in interpreting and phrasing policy. Professor Seymour, I pointed him out earlier, he's Skull and Bones and future president at Yale. His summary of the trend of Mr. Litman's contribution is correct when he says, "It is my impression that Litman furnished the abstract ideas which found their way into a good many of the memoranda at the American delegation and ultimately into some of President Wilson's public speeches. Mr. Litman's method of work at once called for an extended organization with technical experts competent to deal with each phase of the vast field that would have to be covered by the peace conference." So Litman's calling for, of course, scientific bureaus led by technical experts, what he called the entering wedge. And this map here is the first ever inquiry map. And we're trying to bring you the best quality we can. It's kind of nearly impossible now to get anything of high quality of this kind of provenance, because it's behind paywalls at universities. And we're getting a lot from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. For whatever reason, these Midwestern universities are kind of a treasure trove. And I think it's because, these states, and they've stated this before, that they're more progressive. The more west you go during Manifest Destiny, the more progressive they found everybody, the more willing to do and try new and different things, really, right? And so the Eastern Seaboard, it's already an established sort of status quo. They were less open to these progressive ideas. So I think that that's probably why a lot of these archives and a lot of this information we can find at Midwestern universities.
Right.
I mean, where does Brandeis go first? But, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Professor Seymour stating just how Litman was able to work the wording, assist everybody in putting proper text in there, and also finding ways around issues, right? There was a lot of issues that they had, and the U.S. Constitution was the biggest one, but he had a talent in synthesizing information, much like all of these guys do, and coming up with solutions. And so that's really why he was there. So Shotwell stating, "My first task, therefore, was to help secure the acceptance of a group of associates in the field of history, geography, and economics," now that's social sciences, "who would be able to concentrate upon specific questions and have the results of their research ready when these issues came up for decision at the peace conference, a task that called for the cooperation of university men, for never before had universities been mobilized for such service. The researchers in this instance were to be drawn from the highest academic capacity in the country," page 4 at the Paris Peace Conference. So they're going to, this is why they went to Ivy League universities. And almost exclusively, they're coming out of Yale, Harvard, and Columbia. The three oldest universities in the United States, as we covered in the last episode, in the rise of the universities. These universities were around before America. Columbia used to be called King's College, and actually was right down Battery Park was in New York, right on the waterfront, until they moved.
That's still the most mind-blowing part about this to me, that all these, Ivy League schools have literally been here before we were America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that leaves all kinds of questions, right? As to, what America is. I think it's just a corporation.
Right, exactly. It's a corporation, and it's a somehow like a playpen of some sort.
Yeah. It's an experiment.
Yeah. And they say
It's an
it.
experiment.
They say it's
Look
an
at,
experiment.
so
It's
we're going to get
always
into
been a
Robert.
social experiment.
Yeah, we're going to get into Robert Cecil. And one of the sources that I use is this book. And what is it called? The Great Experiment. And Lord Robert Viscount Cecil is one of the primary authors of the League of Nations. And that is why he named that book The Great Experiment, because that is what he's talking about in here, the creation of the League of Nations.
Wow.
And that's the vampire that will,
Yeah.
it's at the end of this video that we're going to be releasing here in the next couple of days.
Excellent.
And I promised Dason Yokoyama to show this book. Yankee from Olympus. He just sent me a message this morning saying, "Hey, have you ever seen that book?" And I didn't realize it at first, but this is one of the books I got from Vancouver when we went book shopping. Paid $10, but it's an incredible source. It's the story of Oliver Wendell Holmes, the guy that, the House of Truth really manipulates. He's a Supreme Court justice too, experimenter on the U.S. Constitution. He was open to it. But he's a Boston Brahmin. So it gave these guys, these Reform Judaists, somebody that they could steer. Boston Brahmin, huge part of Boston, the Brahmins, right? And so they, as we've shown earlier, they sort of flatter their way into his good books, and they've become very influential on Oliver Wendell Holmes. So there were those in the State Department who were by no means happy at the way in which the preparations for the peace conference were being made. This was not only natural under the circumstances, but from the standpoint of public law, had apparent justification. If the State Department did not have full control of the preparation for negotiations, how could it play any effective part in their actual conduct? Men whose lives had been spent in diplomatic service could hardly be expected to regard favorably the creation of a temporary body of so-called experts as the president's advisors in so many important aspects of the negotiation of peace, nor to look forward with equanimity to the prospect of having this improvised organization take any formal part in the work for the peace conference. The State Department properly felt that the problem in this particular case covered practically the whole field of our foreign relations at the most critical and even revolutionary turning point in the history of American diplomacy. So here we are at a huge pivot in American history, right? This is where America becomes the American exceptionalists, right? This is the birth of the American century. We talk about this all the time. The 20th century was America's. Well, this is the birth of it, the very founding first baby steps. So in their eyes, it was one thing for the president to have a personal advisor in Colonel House, but quite a different thing for the colonel's staff to develop to the point of displacing the established governmental organ for foreign affairs. So we know Colonel House was a minister without portfolio. He wasn't an elected official. He's really the poster boy for scientific technical expert. We didn't elect him, but he's there persuading Wilson too. But what we've found is that he's acting also in the role of a front, a blind, to keep our buddy Brandeis in the shadows, because it's really Brandeis that's the most influential on Wilson, as we've seen, and as he's shown. He's the architect of the new freedom. The entire presidential platform comes from the mind of Brandeis, not House. So he's just stating there that there was a major problem. The State Department had a problem, and legally they were justified. So he's stating there that it was against the law for these guys to do that, step in and usurp the State Department, right? And it certainly is against constitutional law. So
and
here
it just happened.
Yep. And it just happened and people accepted it. I mean, there was actually major backlash to this whole thing, right? But obviously we don't hear it anymore. So from Columbia University's own website, James T. Shotwell appointed full professor in 1908. Shotwell scholarship focused on medieval Europe. There's another trend that we see. These guys are all experts in medieval European history. This is also the same with the previously mentioned Norbert Wiener's father, Leo. He's working with the inquiry too, because he's a professor at Harvard, and he's the first professor of Slavic language. So when it came to that area of the globe, they consulted Leo Wiener, the father of cybernetics.
It's getting more and more curious.
It just gets incredible. So in 1919, he attended the Paris Peace Conference as a member of President Wilson's Foreign Policy Advisory Group. Shotwell was involved in the creation of the International Labor Organization in 1919, and in 1945 promoted the inclusion of human rights in the United Nations Charter. You can see he's around for a long time. He served as president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, 1949 to 1950, but as we've shown, he was around. He worked for them for 40-something years. And he's close personal friends with Charles Beard and James Harvey Robinson, two radical professors at Columbia that get booted from there. They're considered founding fathers of progressivism as well. So we can see these progressive guys are trying to push progressive policies in universities, and they're actually getting pushed out. There's major conflict there. Now, I don't know if that is just to sort of promote it and get it out into the lexicon to popularize these ideas, but it certainly wasn't to stop them, because here we are 100 years later and those ideas have fully matured, right?
Right, and now there's no mistaking it that the fall from grace is planned and part of the agenda, part of the mask.
Yeah.
And at that time, who knows, it could have been legit. Like, these progressives were really shaking things up for all the old cranky folks in low middle offices and managerial positions and stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps it was rebellious, quote unquote, but the people pulling the strings, like Brandeis, he's thinking like 60 years ahead. It's crazy.
Yeah.
He's thinking generations ahead, more importantly.
Yep. And thinking of us, they're children of the future. We are their children of the future. So this is why I say we're in a unique place in history where we can judge from 100 years of hindsight, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can look at what they're doing and then make final judgment on it. This is the key to all of this work, and the key for everybody to understand this, because then we can expose it and stop being fooled by it in cycles. It seems every generation gets fooled by the progressive messages, the nice sounding words. They tug at our liberal sentimentalities. Now, I'm not asking anybody to turn into an asshole at all, because, I believe in a lot of the same concepts. It's not really necessarily an argument as to what we want to see our society in. It's the techniques that they're using to get us there. And I think,
and who it is behind it. What
and the real motivations
are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So from this coordination of public and private sectors, Shotwell admits is the catalyst to similarly set up organizations like the War Industries Board, the War Trade Board, and the United States Shipping Board. And we're going to get to those guys in a bit, but those are key aspects to, the World War, American involvement. This is how they commandeered the factories to stop making whatever it was that they were making and start making bullets and bombs. And it all created out of executive order and ran by Bernard Baruch, also Phi Beta Kappa, and close friends with House of Truth and Jewish, Reformed Jew too, just like Litman, Brandeis, Frankfurter. They're all Reform Judaic followers of Reform Judaism. So the Temple El Emmanuel in New York on Lexington, this is where Litman went to church, if they did, but they're really secularists. They didn't grow up religious, but they are Reformed. They're followers of Reformed Judaism. And when you Google that or internet search that, it'll come up with also called progressive Judaism.
Oh, interesting. Also known as like Frankism light.
Right. Totally. So all of it realized under executive order, Shotwell calling it then the philosophy of crisis government, knowing crisis must be met by organs free from bureaucratic impediments and act directly with or under the chief executive. Emergency committees created out of the crisis of war proved very effective in getting things accomplished. And after Paris, this philosophy of fear was brought back to the States and used ever since during times of peace. Bernays, father of propaganda, famously says this is really what inspires him to open up the first ever propaganda or public relations office was that they realized that they could do the same things in times of peace.
Yeah.
And so creating fear to manipulate society and make the changes that they want, right? To mold society more dear to the heart's desire is what the Fabians called it. And so Litman's he's a Fabian member. So is Harold Lasky. They're both residents of the House of Truth, close personal friends with George Graham Wallace. We've already talked about how Brandeis, through scientific management, bringing together industrial relations and the protocol of peace. And he's talking about industrial democracy. And that's the book that the Fabians wrote. So we can see a definite continuity of thought there. They're all thinking the same thing. So the peace treaty was not to be a return to the old diplomacy, but the establishment of a new world order. He says it again in the same book, page 11, wow. APPC. The Inquiry, the American Answer to Similar Wartime-Inspired Organizations by the English under George W. Prothero and the French under Jean Morel, the Comité d'études. It's a French version of the Inquiry. And there I stated that they all considered the Inquiry amateurish, just to make sure I got that point across. So someday the Inquiry will find its historian.
And how ironic.
Yeah, I wanted to include this because we believe that we are this historian. And that puts us in a very epic place, as admitted by Shotwell here. Someday the Inquiry will find its historian, and this strange experiment in the mobilization of social sciences to help in shaping the outlines of the new world structure, which had to be built out of the ruins of the war, will offer a subject with unique possibilities.
Wow, dude. This is like he's reaching through time.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So you talk about how they just talk about openly things, back in the day, they would use this term New World Order all the time.
Yeah.
But it's only now, New World Order has fallen victim to the same sort of tools as conspiracy theorists.
Well, right, exactly. Because New World Order, now that we've done all this work, it's so obvious that it was just interchangeable with so many other terms that had that word new in it and all these attractive terms.
Yeah.
Socially engineered terms.
Yep. So that's one of my favorite quotes of all time. Someday
that's epic.
Will find its historian, man. And when
when
I read that, I almost threw my computer across the room because I knew that there was an incredible opportunity here. And so we are trying to push it into the open as hard as we can. As you can see, we're on part 10 coming up next week. And, we're not going to stop trying to expose this because this is really everything. So the League of Nations was the culmination of decades of coordinated work towards an international governing body, nothing less than a scientific technical expert gone international. The path can be clearly traced back from the League's official inception in 1919 through several international meetings spanning 70 years and attended by the world's most prominent thinkers in international law, including perhaps its most influential, Karl Marx. The true history shows internationalism as a critical aspect to both Marxist, socialist, and radical liberal thought. The final words in Marxist manifesto, working men of all countries unite. It's the final thing he says.
That is unreal.
Marx, listed as a journalist, was the leader of the first international in 1864. Now, these are the first meetings to try to create an international order of law, otherwise known as the International Working Men's Association. Now, Marx was the leader of that. That officially started this most modern movement towards internationalism, with an appropriate exclamation point there. So both internationalism and Marx promised victory for labor through a collective security, the uniting of all within one universal community, just like the American leaders of the progressive era, led by Brandeis, promised American labor. It's the same plan, same pattern. They're just going international now. They realized, and I'm sure that they learned this from the Prussian Reformation.
Right, absolutely, because it's all about expansion.
Yep. And total revolutionary reform of government. So leading ethical Fabian socialists continued to build on the Marxist-inspired international tradition. Fabians like J.A. Hobson, Ramsay MacDonald, George Bernard Shaw, Sidney Webb, Graham Wallas, gaining major influence for their socialist mission by establishing the British Labour Party, a legitimate and still very influential political party within the British Parliament. That's Tony Blair, right? So still super, super influential, maybe the most influential party in British Parliament for the last, since I was born. So Webb, a member of the executive board and drafted the Labour Party's first policy statement. That's a founder of the Fabian Society, a member of the executive board and drafting the Labour Party's first ever policy statement. Influential Fabian John Maynard Keynes, also incredibly important in setting the predominant Western economic philosophy of the 20th century with Keynesian economics, a term we've all heard before, a belief in the government taking a more active role in their country's economies by borrowing during times of recession as an answer to the free market laissez-faire. So you can see the things that they have in common. They all want the end of laissez-faire. But John Maynard Keynes has a major problem with what happens in Paris and actually leaves. And just like Litman writes a book about what happened there in Public Opinion, John Maynard Keynes writes his most famous book as a critique of what happened at the Paris Peace Conference. He was upset with the final conclusions made in that Treaty of Versailles, written by the Dulles brothers, by the way.
Oh.
So influential Fabian John Maynard Keynes, also incredibly important in setting the predominant Western economic philosophy of the 20th century. Internationalism pushed into the new century by the Fabians, assisted by their very close friend, the American Progressives. So same mission as Marx had set out in 1864. He's a major figure in the First International. Basically, those two things are synonymous, Marx and the First International. So here's another incredible map that I want to draw people's attention to. Okay, so it's the ethnic backgrounds of all of these people in Central Europe. This is an official inquiry map. And you can see there's doodles on it. They've actually drawn things on here. And what I want to draw attention to here is that basically outlines the Lithuanian-Polish border. So the Pale of Settlement, are you familiar with this? The Pale of Settlement. Okay, so and I just learned this a couple of years ago, but the Pale of Settlement is this area in Central Europe where all the Jews were pushed because they weren't welcome in Russia and they weren't welcome in the West. So they all congregated in this Central European area that was known then as the Lithuanian-Polish corridor, I believe, but more colloquially known as the Pale of Settlement. So this is a home of the Jews, primarily throughout history.
And it's sitting here in all their maps and notes.
Yep. And so this is the main area that they focus on at the Paris Peace Conference. And we've seen perpetual war in this area ever since. And it is reaching its culmination here in the year 2024 right now. So we're going to get back to this map because there's more mind-blowing stuff to do with it. But first, British members of the Round Table Group, Lord Milner, Robert Cecil, two ministers without portfolio, just as House was, just as Brandeis. Within the British government, though, these are direct descendants from the Rhodes Round Table. Milner is like best friends with Cecil Rhodes. And Rhodes famously says, as Milner goes, I go. Once Milner's the head of the Rhodes Round Table. And that's when Cecil Rhodes was sick and dying in 1902. He handed over the reins to Lord Milner. So we know Cecil Rhodes, as a Rothschild agent, goes down to Africa in the scramble for Africa and basically establishes the whole industry of diamonds and De Beers. So Robert Cecil, Lord Milner, two incredibly important guys to understand here. They were very involved in the creation of the League of Nations. And besides them, in their ear, as it were, were two House of Truth residents, Philip Kerr, who's now known as Lord Lothian, and Eustace Percy, first Baron of Percy Newcastle. So these guys go way back too, getting names like those. Their daddies and their daddies were important people too. And these are both guys that were staying at the House of Truth when they were in Washington on behalf of British foreign policy. They would hang out with Frankfurter and Litman, and who knows what they were discussing, but that's a fact. They were hanging out there. So that was a strange realization as well. These sort of British roundtable members living with these American progressives at this house 1 mile from the White House is kind of a strange thing.
I can only imagine the conversations were very similar to those that Timothy Leary had with Captain Trips and all of his buddies.
Yeah, I mean, they're experimenting on society. They're persuading society, right? They're using the same techniques. If I had a time machine, that's where I would go back to 1727 19th Street, Northwest Washington.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'd walk right up the steps and knock on that door.
Right.
Historians here.
Yeah, stop doing what you're doing.
Yeah. So subsequent congresses at Geneva, we're talking about this long game, this long move to create international authority over to subvert nation states, right? Because they first got rid of the kings and queens, and in their place came the nation state, but they fully knew that at some point the nation state was going to fall as well, because they had a greater idea. And so subsequent congresses at Geneva, Lausanne, Brussels, The Hague, and many others led to the Theodore Roosevelt inspired 1907 Hague Conference, where they codified the Lieber Code. Lieber, for those who have been following along, a Prussian professor, the first international code of law. And he's one of these German historical professors that taught some of our American progressives. So going back to a couple episodes ago, here he is again. And this is a Roosevelt-inspired Hague Conference in which actually for the first time international law is codified. They're making it reality. So labor legislation. See the Copenhagen Congress of 1910, where labor legislation was enacted, limiting work days to 8 hours, minimum age to 14, the prohibition of night work, uninterrupted rest of 36 hours per week. So that's a weekend, inspection of working conditions. All around the same time, Brandeis and the National Consumers League is establishing the same legislation inside the United States.
They're micromanaging everything. That's like part of their process is like every system needs 10 systems within it. And so on and so on and so on.
Yep. And that's really what a middle manager or micromanager is. That's why he pisses us all off so much, because he's this scientific expert that may or may not be correct.
Right.
But we're listening to him because he's presenting facts and statistics to things that are subjective, not objective. But, you know, maybe I should pause here because I'm seeing a lot of people use facts, the word facts, and facts specifically, as a synonymous to the truth. That's not accurate. Facts are subjective. They can be looked at 100 different ways. They're the furthest thing from the truth. And this is how they've been able to slide this in, right? By using facts and stats. And we talked about how the Brandeis brief was created like that. There was 100 pages in it, but, you know, there was only like a handful that were, you know, a part of a legal argument. The rest was just statistics and facts that they had collected from Columbia University, by the way.
Great.
Yeah. So they can make stats say anything. And that's why they love them. So this long historical chain of meetings culminating with the Inter-Allied Conferences, 1914 to 1918. So that's exactly the same year that Britain enters the war. They start these Inter-Allied Conferences talking about peace conditions. So this is another great realization that they don't wait until the war is over to start figuring out what they're going to do. They've already been working on it just as long as they were working on getting themselves to war. Because what does this sort of speak to? is, again, dialectics. They're creating a problem and they're already thinking about the solutions.
Oh, absolutely. They're always 10 steps ahead of this. This is
Yeah.
just like the yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay. So the Inter-Allied conferences that authored the final drafts of the League of Nations months prior to the Paris Peace Conference. So it's September 1918. So about 2.5 months before the American delegation shows up in Paris, they've already got it all figured out. And they did it at these Inter-Allied conferences that were also called Inter-Allied Socialist Labor and Socialist Conferences. I think we covered that in previous episodes where the credentials actually said Inter-Allied Labor and Socialist Conferences, and people were upset at the inclusion of the word socialist in there.
C
So
Truth, real quick, C Truth says statistics is theoretical math. You can
Right.
come up with any answer you want.
Great point. And what is theoretical math, but our mathematical modeling we see, right? This is really what persuaded society during COVID was mathematical models.
Absolutely.
So
Theoretical
here we are 100
ones.
years later, they've mastered this stuff and look at just how influential it can be on people. They put
Yeah, it's
experimental
disgusting.
liquids into their body and their children, something they've never seen before with their own eyes. But because the technical scientific expert says to do it, they do it.
It's
This is
awful.
what's really inspired this whole 10-part series, is to get to the bottom of why and who created this massively effective tool. So Sidney Webb, a chairman and member of the Commission on War Aims, he really wrote the war aims. This is where they switch from peace talk to war aims. The language changes here, thanks to the Fabians. And the same movement meant as a global overseer, and it's the precursor to the United Nations. Walter Litman, the primary author of the League of Nations, through his authoring of the 14 points. There's no debating this. Isaiah Bowman and David Hunter Miller are also helping him, but Litman is the primary author of the 14 points, which are in the proceedings of these Inter-Allied Labor and Socialist conferences. And it shows all 14 points. They mention Wilson as the catalyst to all of this. And so the 14 points is really what they all sort of circle around, and that becomes their common ground in the creation of the League of Nations. It's all based off that. And if you look at the 14 points and compare it to the United Nations Charter, they'll look very similar. So all three of those guys, founding members of the inquiry. So there was 4 or 5 working out of the library. Those are 3 of them right there.
Wow.
So it was at the final Inter-Allied Conference in London, September 1918, that the American scheme headed by Wilson's 14 points was adopted, calling for the free navigation of the sea, the removal of economic barriers, and an equity of trade worldwide, a reduction in national armaments, a restoration of all French territory lost to Germany during the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, and the 14th and final point, the creation of a general association of nations to be formed for the purposes of collective security. So that's taken right out of the proceedings of the Inter-Allied Labor and Socialist Conferences. You can find that on our library. So here's another map. We're going to comment on both of those in a minute. So as we have discussed at length in Brandeis Part 5, Industrial Democracy and the Protocol of Peace, the democratization of the shop floor was the first steps towards a democratized national workforce and then an eventual industrial democracy as a nation. Sidney Webb writing the book in 1896. Here's where their plan went international, the industrial democratization of the world. And we called it the domestication of the American, and I would say it's the same thing here on an international level. So the aforementioned Lord Robert Cecil, one of the primary founders of the League of Nations, called the entire idea of an international order of law the Great Experiment, as I've shown earlier, shown the actual book. that any ambitious power dominated by a tyrannical government should be able to plunge the nations into war and inflict incalculable suffering on mankind is intolerable. It was to prevent this that the great experiment of the League of Nations was carried out. And he's calling it a great experiment. Cecil, writing in 1944 on the cusp of the UN, the report of the Dumbarton Oaks Conference is the first blueprint of the future machine for the maintenance of peace. The LNU, which was the League of Nations Union, which is one of the organizations that created the League of Nations 30 years almost prior to him writing this in 1944. The LNU had already the same thing a few months ago. I think that's a spelling check. And to speak frankly, I do not think the official effort is any improvement on ours, but there is not much difference between the two. Both provide for a body representing the whole of the states members of the new organization called the Assembly. And when you put them side by side, they're very similar. Just go on their website. They'll show you. There's no dispute as to the League of Nations being directly the precursor to the United Nations. So in both, there is a smaller body called the Council, consisting partly of permanent and partly of elective members. There is to be a Secretary General and a Secretariat in each case, as well as a Court of Justice like the existing one. Social and economic questions are to be dealt with by committees who are to report to the Assembly. That's from the Dumbarton Oaks Plan. So Shotwell, back to James Shotwell, and others recognizing the dangerous dilemma of allowing power to be taken from government and given to unelected officials. For if the power to make labor treaties were to be taken over by a body containing so large an element of unofficial representatives, what about the power to enforce treaties? Should the governments be held responsible for carrying out proposition arrived at and agreed upon in the formulation of which they had been partly shut out? So the result would be to make a government little more than a police state for the administration of regulations arrived at by these industrial parliaments. In short, there would have risen something like a world state under the aegis of industrial democracy. So he says that.
Sounds like exactly what's going on today. It sounds exactly like the past few years. It's unreal.
Yeah, so you're seeing crossover in language. Somebody like James T. Shotwell is somewhat disparate from your Fabians, you would think, but here they are. Because they're progressives pushing a Fabian agenda, or Fabian founded, through the Prussian Reformation 100 years prior to this, they're all speaking the same language is the point. So this is exactly what we argued or are arguing that happened. The expert official given unfettered international authority over national state governments stretched out over 100 years has greatly exploited the vulnerability of nation states and created our modern industrial democracy, which is fascism. I would say that
literally.
Public-private, and we're going to get to that too. So they create the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and they become sister groups for foreign affairs. We talked about the Resolute Desk and this relationship between the British and American. This is a major part of them coming together too, right here. On May 30th, 1919, a little group of diplomats and scholars from Britain and the United States convened at the Hotel Majestic. This is where the British were staying, to discuss how their fellowship could be sustained after the peace. They proposed a permanent Anglo-American Institute of International Affairs, with one branch in London, the other in New York. Now that they do change that name in 1921 to the Council on Foreign Relations. And that is from the book Continuing the Inquiry by Peter Gross, who is a CFR member. And you can find that book on their website right now, cfr.org, I think. So the inquiries work much like that of Brandeis, based on a quantitative collection of scientific information, heavily influenced the proceedings in Paris as they redefined borders, deleting countries while bringing new ones to life. A total restructuring of Central European relationships that is still going on in the same place today. So I want to show a picture here. So this is National Defense Council, something like that. It's really some of the first American thinkers on foreign policy. So they're sitting here taking a picture. This is actually the majority of these guys. Actually, every one of these guys are in Wilson's administration. It's the Secretary of War, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Agriculture, things like that. And on the wall here, very important, is Elihu Root, Henry Stimson, and the light hits this not quite right, but if you zoom in, you can see it says William Howard Taft. And I don't think we can zoom in that well here, but you can see where it says Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, and Elihu Root. He's the head of Carnegie Endowment at this time, but he was Secretary of War under both Roosevelt and Taft. So they're skull and bones, Phi Beta Kappa. So they're being memorialized here on the wall, and it's deliberately, this picture is deliberately being taken in front of those.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Right? So they're commemorating these skull and bones Phi Beta Kappas for establishing, really making the first steps into America becoming an international force, because they're underneath Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War. And so here's another picture of them with a little later, after some changing of the hierarchy. And you can see that there's more members here, some very important figures in here. The most important that I want to point out is this tall guy in the back. That is the lone wolf of Wall Street, Bernard Baruch. He's the chairman of the War Industries Board. And when we talk fascism, we talk public-private partnerships. And he's the chair of the War Industries Board. He is basically controlling the world at this point during war. He's determining what gets shipped, what the Americans give the Brits, and vice versa. Phi Beta Kappa. He's not a House of Truth resident, but he lives just down the road. Not kidding either. So here is Shotwell stating, because, you know, at the Paris Peace Conference is largely borrowed from his diary. He wrote every day, just like David Hunter Miller and several of these guys. You know, Shotwell, being the historian, librarian of all of this, had to document. That was one of his primary jobs. So at the Paris Peace Conference is largely written from his diaries. And this is one excerpt here. Breakfast with Young, Westerman, and Bowman in Bowman's room. Young, he's the economist for the Fabian, what is it called? The economic organization that the Fabians create. London School of Economics. Okay, so Young, when we're talking Young here, he's a professor at the London School of Economics, so he's a Fabian. So he was troubled over what may happen to his division of economics now, after the arrival of John Foster Dulles and the men who worked with Gay at the various controls, the War Trade Board and War Industries Board. So here comes all of these guys showing up in Paris, led by John Foster and Alan Dulles. And the guy that they're mentioning here, Gay, is Edwin Gay. He's an inquiry member too. And he's famous really in my research because when JP Morgan famously takes over all the 25 most powerful newspapers in America, Gay becomes, he is one of JP Morgan's editors that he puts in place. And he's an inquiry member. And he's influential in the War Trade Board, War Industries Board. He's it's the central department or something. It's like the center of all of it. And that's why they had controls in parentheses or in bracket quotations. So these connections to Bernard Baruch, the Dulles brothers, and the pioneers of the CIA before the OSS tells the real story. The problems being worked out at the Paris Peace Conference had little to do with peace and more to do with economic questions of an imminent and imposing system of internationalism. This now leading our research directly to the creation of the military-industrial complex 25 years before Truman and over 40 years before Eisenhower warned us of, not the military industrial complex, but I want to draw attention to the technological scientific elite that he also mentions. This is
Whoa.
one aspect of his speech that never gets covered. But he talks
No.
about, yeah, and only a wise uh, citizenship will be smart enough to see what they're doing. Only
Oh
if we're
my.
engaged and enlightened enough. If you go back to that Eisenhower farewell address, that's what he says. It's the technological scientific elite that we need to be worried about. And he mentions the military industrial complex. Well, it was already well established by then. Eisenhower's farewell address, 1961. So that's, 15 years after Second World War.
Right.
By then, this technological scientific elite were normal, just a normal aspect of our life.
Wow. Oh my
So
God.
the origins of fascism in America and the rise of the Bush dynasty emerged from the War Industries Board, all created out of crisis government. From the embers of war. This is why we call this our series From the Embers of War. And here we see all of the familiar names looking not for peace, but the end of competition, the free market, and sovereignty. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, the House of Rothschild, the Lazard brothers, and all the international banking families are in Paris. And Shotwell sitting down having lunch with all of these guys. So from page 10 at the Paris Peace Conference, moreover, the purely documentary contribution of my division was supplemented by a series of meetings with the representatives of European government. Now, this is the work. He's talking here about the work in New York before they get to Paris. So as we've shown here, the first memo is in the fall of 1917. And so they have like a year and a bit to grab all of these facts, create these maps, and create the best argument that they can going over to Paris. And so here he's talking about the time in New York, and where they're doing their work is at the AGS building at 3755 North Broadway. And it's like 2 stops from Columbia and 3 stops from the City College of New York. So the City College of New York president, Sidney Mezes, is the brother-in-law of Colonel Edward House, and he's like the figurehead leader of the inquiry at the beginning, but he's nowhere near a leader of men. So he kind of gets pushed to the side, and Isaiah Bowman, the real life Indiana Jones, becomes, and he pushes Litman aside too, and becomes the chief executive officer of the inquiry, largely because he's the president of the American Geographical Society, and this is where the best map making equipment is in America. Mm-hmm. So all of the work goes to 3755 North Broadway, northern Manhattan, and within 4 subway stops is Columbia University, the AGS, New York City College. So they can just hop on the train and in 5 minutes be back and forth. And so what he's talking about here is during that time. Okay, so while they're formulating all of the maps and gathering and collating, cataloging, they're also going at night collectively as a group to the Columbia University Club. So moreover, the purely documentary contribution of my division was supplemented by a series of meetings with the representatives of European governments or factions, held for the most part in the evenings and in a private dining room at the Columbia University Club. Not the least interesting of these occasions were those when Professor Mazarek expounded the philosophy of self-determination for Eastern Europe, with the map which he had prepared hanging on the wall, and the members of the inquiry gathered like a class in a seminar. So Mazarek, as I state here, he becomes the first president of Czechoslovakia when the inquiry creates it. And he gifted a full-length portrait of himself to Shotwell in the University Club at Columbia as a thank you. Now, Mazarek is a professor at Columbia at this time. Okay, he's a professor at Columbia giving foreign lectures to the men that are about to go over to Europe and create the country that he becomes president of. Now, this is where we go back to these maps. Okay, the maps that we've been showing as the background, they were gifted too. You can see
Oh my
that it
God.
says from President Masaryk of Czechoslovakia, acquired gift October 1918. So that's a gift to the AGS or the inquiry, and they're held at the American Geographical Society because that's where Isaiah Bowman was. So it's a quid pro quo, I state there, right? Pretty obvious that he's sort of informing them on probably medieval tradition, what has happened there before, giving them advice on possibly where they should be placing their borders. And these are happening all the time, and not just with Masaryk, but other European governments or factions.
Wow.
So they're getting educated on foreign policy there. Okay. And so this is the American delegation. Now we see the five out front. They seem to be the figureheads, right? The important ones, but they're the least important ones. The most important right here in the center, the Lone Wolf of Wall Street, Bernard Baruch. Right here, it's John Foster Dulles, just a young man. He's got his hand. We believe his hand is on the Secretary General. Everything flows through this guy, Gru. He's Groton, the private grammar school for boys. Groton, very famous, secret sort of, elite schooling. He's the center of all of this. And I didn't include the organizational chart, but it is in our video that I'm going to be releasing here soon. So that's John Foster Dulles. We believe his hand is on there. It doesn't look like it would be Bernard Baruch's, and it looks a little unnatural for JP Morgan lawyer John Davis to have his hand around there, don't you think?
Yeah.
Looks a little too cowboyish. So I do think that is John Foster Dulles' hand on the shoulder of the guy that's really controlling all communication. And where's his brother? Alan Dulles? Well, he's over here. He's hanging out with the inquiry in the back, right here.
Interesting.
That's Alan Dulles as a young man, and they're establishing American intelligence. And all these guys in the back here, D.W. Johnson, Charles Seymour, future president of Yale. This is R.H. Lord. He goes off. There's CIA documents about him during the Paris Peace Conference going to Poland, meeting with the Polish government to establish the borders. So these guys are all high-level intelligence diplomats. These are really CIA agents before they were called that. Here's Day.
Wow.
James T. Shotwell. Here's the head of American News.
Oh, geez.
He's really he puts a governor on information coming in and coming out of the Paris Peace Conference. He writes Woodrow Wilson's biography. And here's James Brown Scott, probably the most prolific American in international law knowledge. And he establishes all kinds of things, including the USC Law School, University of Southern California. So when we look at a crime scene, I would say that this is one, and we're looking at, I don't want to say 100% complicit with all these men, but, a lot of them know what's going on, the least of which probably are the five out front.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's the whole point of the middle management, the merchant class,
Yeah.
to stand in there and thinking they're in charge.
Yep. And so here's the early CIA over here. Shepherdson's here. And another key guy, I can't remember his name right now, but he's a key guy in the founding of the CIA. And here's Woodrow Wilson's personal physician, also Phi Beta Kappa. He was the physician of Wilson, Roosevelt, and Taft, Cary Grayson.
Wow.
So the American delegation to Paris, taken inside the Eagle Room, is what it's called at the Palace of Versailles. Inquiry at the back, Alan and John Foster Dulles present, along with the Lone Wolf of Wall Street, the chairman of War Industries Board. So when you want to look at a picture and body language and find out, who's the leaders, I would say that, Baruch is front and center there with Gru. Those are really the two most influential guys in Paris, because all questions are about economics, not liberation of backwards races. It's just, an excuse that they're using that sounds good.
Right.
So Bernard Baruch, also Phi Beta Kappa, and the rise of the expert on international affairs begins here. These are the authors of the Second World War through their creation of the Treaty of Versailles, a complete demoralization of the German people we today in the West are only too familiar with. We're seeing the same sort of things going on, this sort of degenerative, hedonistic interests of a society kind of gone mad. It's really what happened in Germany, and it was a direct result of these guys creating the Treaty of Versailles.
Right.
And so from Confessions of a Reformer, Frederick C. Howe, stating, it is impossible to tell yet whether peace is being drafted by the international bankers or the munitions makers. Economic forces moved the conference like players around a chessboard. Boundary lines were shifted to include harbors, copper, oil, mineral resources. Races were split, natural demarcations ignored. The imperialist interests that had kept the world on edge for 30 years before the war were making a killing. The British Admiralty wanted oil. It had talked oil for years. British maritime prescience saw that oil was the fuel of tomorrow. The French Steel Trust wanted a grip on coal and iron ore to gain command of the continent and strip Germany of her war-making power. Munition makers were busy. They were getting ready for the next war. So he's there. He's at the Paris Peace Conference. He's involved in all of this, and he writes a book called The Confessions of a Reformer. And that's what he states. He's just substantiating everything that we've been saying and substantiating everything that hindsight over 100 years has told us, right?
Yeah.
So
that's an incredible quote. That's a big find.
Yeah, this is really, it's been quite incredible to bring this all back together to Brandeis and show, how the rise of internationalism largely came out of the rise of the university.
That's unreal.
So they had to establish the university network first, and then they were pulling all of these social scientists from the highest, levels of intelligence from these Ivy League universities and using them to steer society.
Everybody that was already there in place, waiting to be enacted, turned on for their chapter in the play.
Yeah.
This is unreal.
So we did that in under 2 hours, buddy. That's okay.
Yes. Yeah, that was beautiful.
I love it.
This was an extremely eye-opening one, man. Not that they all haven't been, but this one was really intense. And so we have one more in our 10-part series. Yeah. What are we looking to get into for our final part?
Well, I would say that I'm solution-based. I'm always wanting to offer solutions. And not that our work in its entirety isn't a giant answer for a bunch of things, but we're going to turn to the education that is in the liberal arts, and we're going to get to the bottom of exactly why they are pursuing and gathering all of these intelligent creatives.
Excellent.
And teaching them the liberal arts. And, we have discussed this in previous episodes that, we really believe that this is the knowledge upon which all of history has been told. We have two classes, conscious and unconscious. Really, you can break it down to that.
Dialectics.
And the trivium and the knowledge in there, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. I think what we find here is really the furthest understandings of our environment and our world. And obviously they're going to hold the most high level of that information in black operations, and they're going to develop that on their own in secrecy. But there's something beyond pi and the Pythagoras triangle, and it goes into some much deeper things. Anybody that knows anything about sacred geometry and the Fibonacci sequence and all of these things, there's secrets about our universe and the environment that we're in found there. And the trivium starts at grammar, goes to logic so that you know how to ask the who, what, why, where questions. And then rhetoric allows us to establish our own style, to be attractive in the way that we want to communicate with others. And so, right, makes sense that they're going to get all these guys, turn them persuasive and sort of, especially if they already have attractive personalities and they're outgoing, like Frankfurter. Frankfurter graduates Harvard Law, magna cum laude. Brandeis graduates Harvard Law with the highest scores that remained unbroken for 80 years, summa cum laude. They're all summa cum laude, magna cum laudes, honor students, Phi Beta Kappa. So if they've gotten one over on us by hiding knowledge and wisdom, then it makes sense that if we can gather that information, we can flip the game board on them. And tomorrow night, we have a second trivium night here at our house. There's 5 of us.
That's
we'll
excellent.
Get together and just having incredible conversations. We're not putting too much pressure on having to understand all of these concepts like the syllogism and the square of contradiction, but there are general high level sort of blanket concepts that are easily understood, like logical fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the power in logical fallacy, if we can learn and identify when people are taking advantage of us, being dishonest or handing us misinformation or just downright lying to us, we'll be able to see it before it even happens. And, my study of this book has been going on for about 10 years now. And if anybody watches how I interact with people, it's much different than normal. And I get incredible results. I don't necessarily ever have to block people because they run from me. Just a few days ago, somebody was sharing that meme about, it not ever being named Palestine. This is sort of a leftist pro-Israel trope that we've heard a lot, that it was never called Palestine. Well, we know that it was. We've already covered that extensively here, that the first organizations that went there to create infrastructure was the Palestine Economic Corporation.
Right.
House of Rothschilds, Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, and a 1925 map with Palestine. Christina Marie just showed me a coin that had Arabic, Hebrew, and English on it. So, we're just going to try to keep going. There's a lot of information still to go. As we talked before we hit record, Louis Brandeis is the founder of Savings Bank Life Insurance. That is probably, honestly, a 10-part series all on its own. And that's
right.
Where I had my security licenses for Solomon Smith Barney, and we were flipping those the Savings Bank life insurance policies. We were turning them into term, and then asking people to invest the difference into a separate savings account so that they weren't using the savings bank life insurance to really burrow out the inside of America without anybody ever knowing it. So how those life insurance policies work is that you pay into them, but as your likelihood of dying increases with every day that you live, the premiums raise. But the premiums coming through your door never change.
Right.
But they're taking money out of your savings account and supplementing that as your payments increase to the point where they self-destruct.
Right, exactly.
So
they disappear altogether.
Yeah, if the main breadwinner loses an arm or loses their ability to work and bring home income or dies in these cases, then it's supposed to be income replacement. And so then you're supposed to be able to, even though the husband is gone and it's a very traumatic situation, at least you would have the same finances coming in to support the mother and whatever children were left behind. Now, that is about as insidious of a plan I ever saw. And so I used to go, I did this in Vancouver, and I would hunt these guys down. This is before I even knew Brandeis. This is before I knew anything about this world. And so that's a whole aspect. There's other aspects to Brandeis that we didn't even cover that make him even more influential. But the one thing that I want people to go away from tonight is the same guy that created Israel is the same guy that established American foreign policy. And those are two of the most destructive forces on earth right now. So I encourage everybody to look more into Louis Dembit's Brandeis. And, we've part 9 now. So go back onto the deep share. And I like, what's his name? Mark Passio. Start at the beginning. Go back to the beginning. Watch part 1, The Architect for the New Freedom, and just watch them one after the other. And it should lay into your brain in a nice way. We've provided primary source material as much as we can. And then, we've also tried to step out of the way, Andy, and not be an authority, right? And just provide the information and say, what do you think?
Exactly. Not present. That's the one thing you were talking about, facts and how they can be used. We're not showing facts. We're showing people and what they did and what they wrote intentionally about the situation.
We're
so
showing
it's plain
evidence.
and simple. Yeah, evidence is a little different.
Yeah.
All right. So everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for being here with us all the way through part 9. And we got one more. And like we've talked about before, that's probably not the end of it either. We'll probably have some bonus content coming out in the weeks, months following with Duane here, as always.
I would say that I'm really being pushed to the farm now. And
Hell yeah.
I spent 6 hours there yesterday. We started at 2 hours, but the weather's been so good here that we're just getting in the ground early.
Hell
and
yeah.
So anybody that's been following my work for the last 7 years, you'll know that I kind of disappear now. I'm back in the fall, but we've set ourselves up at the farm, so it may be easier to do podcasts straight from the farm in the greenhouse, which is a great place to think and talk. And so we've got a plan to do that. And so if we're going to do that, I don't necessarily have to create an article. We can talk about things, without the need of an article to read, right? So that's what we're looking at, probably doing, continuing with you in that format until it's fall again and we can, dive in again 100%.
Absolutely.
So,
man.
Thanks everybody for being here, man. Part 9. We've got one more to go. And I hope that this is really starting to hit home with people as to, the importance of understanding the rise of the expert, because this creates a great argument for when your buddies and your friends are like, oh, I'll believe a scientific expert over an internet warrior like you.
Right. Exactly.
It gives us some ammo.
Well, we're getting a lot of thank yous, a lot of brilliance, a lot of comments in support of this work every week,
buddy.
and everyone's treating it like night class. So I appreciate it.
We're almost done.
Everybody. Yeah. Tune in next week. See you then.
See you guys.